My first book was called The Black Officer Corps, and most of my research looks at the ascension of African American officers, institutional racism, systemic racism, and 1960s culture. And one of the things that when you examine the historical memory of different minority groups is that they have a different recall, a different memory versus some of the official histories. And that's largely because much of the history has either tried to work them into what the official line was, be it race, be it memory of the war, be it resistance to the draft. But once we get into later years, when we're able to draw upon oral histories, that has allowed them to have a voice that they didn't have before, because now we have academics who are curious about what these people thought versus what the institution said. One of the things about the draft that we have to remember in the 1960s is that there were deferments. Deferments could be gained, race did not matter, but what did matter was the economic status. So while African Americans and white Americans could apply and get deferments, the problem was that most African Americans could not afford to go to college. Therefore, if you didn't have a deferment to go to college, you would be drafted. So the vast majority of blacks who wind up going to the Vietnam War and serving are those who simply were not able to afford to stay in college, or they, in the early part, there were qualifications tests that was called the AFQT, and that kept some of them from serving, whether it be for mental capacity or perhaps even a physical capacity where they couldn't pass a draft physical. As we move forward into the war and numbers become more of a question, we need more manpower, the standards of the American service member for entering Vietnam are lowered. So some of the men who didn't qualify to enter the military in 1965, by the time we get to 1967 and 68, those men are said that they are now able to enter the draft. And one of them was Muhammad Ali. For the draft, it not only affects African Americans, but it affects Latinos as well, poor whites, largely because, again, for their economic status, they cannot enter the draft. Statistically, when we look at African American service during the Vietnam War, African Americans are making up somewhere around 11% of the population. But in various years of the war, they will make up somewhere around 26% of the combat casualties. So one thing about discrimination is that overrepresentation can be discrimination as well. And when we look at certain years of the Vietnam War, the casualties were much higher for minorities than it was for other Americans. One thing that the military did after it began to examine racial tension across the military, you had ships where there were mutinies, you had fraggings in Vietnam, you had racial tension in and around various military bases across the South. So the way that they decided to combat this was through education. And the solution they came up with was called the Defense Race Relations Institute, also known as DRY. And while this was at Patrick Air Force Base, Cocoa Beach, Florida, you had the Army and the Navy and the Air Force would bring in equal opportunity officers, and they would have training on cultural background. Also, they'd have minorities there where they could communicate the grievances that African Americans had, but also for white Americans, how they tended to see the plight of minorities. So you have to remember that when you're coming up to the 1960s and you have the draft and you're putting all these groups together, the country was basically segregated. So this is going to be the first contact in close quarters, eating together, fighting together, sleeping together, that the country has really been through. Remember, we have a segregated military up to 1948, and it's very slow to integrate, and integration isn't finished until 1953. But again, we still have animosity between the races, and one of the catalysts of that is when we get to the civil rights movement. There were two prevailing mindsets when it would come to African Americans dealing with white superior officers and NCOs. One has been the celebrated traditional role that, hey, they're serving their country, this is an adventure, and they're answering this, this masculinity gene. This is what men do when your country calls. By the time we're getting again to the mid and late 1960s, you have a group of African Americans that, you know, on Monday, they were at a civil rights march or perhaps a Black Power meeting, and 7 months later, they're over in the jungles of Vietnam. So you have a group of people that they don't look at this as an American fight. They believe that why are we fighting for democracy and rights in Southeast Asia when we don't have these at home in the United States? That's guaranteed to them under the Constitution. So this is going to be the angst of a lot of racial tension. You see that for many African Americans, the military is an economic engine, and they will volunteer often for some of the most dangerous jobs, some of the most elite types of position. Why? Because it pays them more money. And coming from the ghetto or perhaps the rural South, even whites who are from these farms, these backwoods places, that this is the first time that they were able to make some decent money, get a skill that they're proud of, and also have a lot of credibility and pride by serving in the military, fighting the country's wars.